Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today for the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series for our third event this term. My name is Eva Bernes-Kempers, and I'm a junior research associate at the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law. For those of you who are attending the Talking Animal series for the first time, just a quick note on the format. So we'll have around 30 to 45 minute presentation first, and then another 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion. The event will end at 6:30 p.m. UK time. You're all warmly invited to participate in the discussion after the talk. In case you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can either signal in the chat that you would like to speak, or you can use the raise hand function. I will then go through the chat or the raised hands in the discussion section, and I will allow you to directly ask your question to our speaker. Until this point, I will keep all attendees' microphones muted. So we will be recording the presentation and later uploading the video to our website, but we won't be recording the Q&A part. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Diego Rossello. Diego Rossello is an associate professor at the Department of Philosophy, the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Santiago, Chile, and he holds a PhD in political science from Northwestern University. He has been a fellow of the Paris Program in Critical Theory at Northwestern of the Law and Humanities Junior Scholar Workshop and of the National Agency of Research and Development in Chile. His work has appeared in many journals such as Political Theory, Philosophy Today, and New Literary History. And he's the author of a recent book, La Teoría Política en el Antropoceno. Diego, thanks for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Eva, for your kind introduction. Also, thanks to Rafael Facel and the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series for the kind invitation to this forum. I'm going to share some basic presentation. I hope you can see it now. Okay, as you all know, the title of this talk is Animal Dignity or Animal Magnetism on Extending Dignity to Non-Human Animals. I've been working on animal dignity for a while now, but I am only beginning what I think will be a long-term project on animal magnetism. And so this talk is a kind of a transition between these two topics. So some prefatory remarks just to start us. In this talk, I will share with you a few arguments on why I believe animal dignitarianism, as I shall call it, should be rejected, along with an outline of a more holistic position based on animal magnetism and harmony with nature. This holistic position sometimes resembles an alternative worldview or even cosmology, which may have affinities with Amerindian indigenous cosmologies, but is also robustly grounded in modern European intellectual history and political theory, or so I shall argue. So I'll begin. Regarded by many as an obscure, even useless conceptual resource, dignity holds nonetheless a significant place in the vernacular of contemporary moral and political philosophy. Rather surprisingly, the most recent quarrel on the notion of dignity takes place in the field of animal rights theory. Animal rights theory was mostly concerned with animal cruelty and negative rights for animals, but the recent political turn in the field shifts focus to conceptual issues around animal citizenship and animal dignity. In this context, when authors in animal rights theory's political turn tackle a strand of literature on human dignity dubbed as dignitarianism, the perils of all speciesism are seen as returning in new clothes. Speciesism in new clothes, or dignitarian speciesism, I argue, is both novel and flagrant. It is noble because, unlike standard species bias, dignitarian speciesism claims the superiority of human species on the basis of the dignity of the human family. It is flagrant because the superiority of the human species is openly construed in contradistinction with non-human animals and nature. In my prior work, I called this type of dignitarian speciesism species aristocratism, in order to highlight the emergence of a new aristocracy of the human family in moral and political philosophy. My aim in my prior work was to show that under the foil of redistributing and horizontalizing aristocratic dignitas, a new type of species hierarchy was being forged. Thus, whereas before democratic revolutions, only a few aristocrats possessed dignity, the dignitarian argument goes, each and every common human being, namely every male human being, now becomes a king in his castle. But what if the kingship of the common man is built upon a new plebeian underdog? Dignitarians often retell the story of democratic revolutions in terms of the redistribution of aristocratic dignity among all human beings, without paying much attention to the status of non-human animals in the revolutionary context. I argue that there is something to be said about the status of non-human animals in popular ideologies prior to the French Revolution. In particular, it should be noted that a camouflage political theory, very much like Rousseau's, became very popular in pre-revolutionary France. Under arcane names such as animal magnetism and mesmerism, several French revolutionaries embraced radical ideas about natural equality and the shared animal condition of both human and non-human species. By remaining inattentive to animal magnetism, dignitarians not only retell a story of the redistribution of aristocratic dignitas in exclusively humanist terms, but also miss the influence that animal magnetism continues to have in eco-criticism today, in the works by theorists like Jane Bennett, Samantha Frost, Eric Sandner, and Kari Weil. So the talk will proceed as follows. The first part reconstructs the argument of what I call exclusive dignitarianism, exemplary represented by George Kadev and Jeremy Waldron. Exclusive dignitarians make claims about the higher stature or status of the human species vis-a-vis other species on Earth, and circumscribe dignity within the contours of human beings alone. This section also discusses Will Kymlicka's critique of exclusive dignitarianism and his notion of human supremacism. Although I am sympathetic to Kymlicka's overall argument, drawing on the work by Bonnie Honig, I highlight possible limitations of his commitment to a shared vulnerability across species. The second part of the talk reconstructs the position of inclusive dignitarians, exemplary in the work by Pablo Gilabert. Inclusive dignitarians, I suggest, seek to remove speciesism from their conception of dignity as status, but remain attached to dignity talk in ways that invite further scrutiny. In a critical dialogue with inclusive dignitarians' commitment to dignity talk, or what I call animal dignitarianism, in part 3, I sketch an alternative approach to species equality based on the notion of animal magnetism. Animal magnetism allows us, or so I shall argue, to problematize the narrative of redistribution of dignity attributed to democratic revolutions and to move away from dignity talk to focus instead on fluxes of sympathy and the quest for harmony across the human-animal divide. The fourth part concludes. So I begin with the first part. I use the term exclusive dignitarianism to describe the position of authors like George Kadev and Jeremy Waldron. According to them, dignity can be predicated of human beings alone. But even if they share an exclusive understanding of dignity, their positions are not identical. On the contrary, whereas Kadev's discussion of human dignity emphasizes the existential superiority of the human species in terms of human stature, Waldron suggests that human dignity can be distilled from its construal in legal context, constitutions, international law, as a higher status or rank. As we shall see, even if stature and status cannot be conceptually assimilated, they coincide in excluding non-human animals and nature from the normative protections that dignity has to offer. A singular thinker that resists classification and an exquisite writer, George Cadev's take on liberal theory has been influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson's take on individuality, by Martin Heidegger's existential philosophy, and Hannah Arendt's political theory. In his major work, Human Dignity, Cadev explores an idiosyncratic distinction between human status and what he calls human stature. For Cadev, human status refers to the basic idea of human equality, namely to the notion that all human beings deserve equal rights in virtue of being humans. Without fully engaging in the controversy between naturalistic and positivist theories of rights, Cadev contends that human equality carries moral weight. Humans are not only equal, but should be treated as equals. More importantly, however, Cadev introduces a distinction between the basic moral status of human equality and what he calls human stature. In his words, this is a quote, a long quote by Cadev. This essay will thus concentrate on the place of the idea of human dignity in the form of equal individual status in the theory of human rights, and on the dignity of the human species in the form of human stature, which is based on unique non-natural capacities. Furthermore, the standing of the human species vis-a-vis other species is not the only form of stature that counts, nor is the stewardship of nature the only active expression of stature. Stature is also tied to the repeated demonstration that humanity has made at any given time, if not the most of itself, then something astonishing and unexpected, that its achievements are great and have shown that at any given time, there could be no foreseeable end to the realization of unsuspected human potentialities. Human stature is essentially an existential, not a moral value, end of quote. Following Cadev's argument for a moment, it is difficult to deny that human beings as a species have achieved great things. To be sure, one could underline humanity's great works of art, literature, music, as well as the groundbreaking discoveries of science. It is also true that humanity has committed various atrocities, from slavery to genocide, and Cadev at times acknowledges this. However, Cadev advances an intriguing argument. He claims that human stature does not have a moral, but an existential value. But what does Cadev mean by existential value? At least part of the argument on human stature hinges upon what Cadev calls the unique non-natural capacities characteristic of the human species. In various passages, Cadev stresses the fact that human stature should be understood as the partial break with nature that allows humans not to be defined and determined by their natural, organic, or biological traits. In Cadev's words, only the human species is, in the most important existential respects, a break with nature and significantly not natural. It is unique among species in not being only natural. The significance of humanity's partial break with nature is stressed throughout the book and is often accompanied by jarring, sweeping accounts on the status of non-human species. For example, in a claim that evokes Martin Heidegger's argument on the abyss of essence separating Dasein from non-human animals, Cadev asserts that, another quote by Cadev, all other species are more alike than humanity is like any of them. A chimpanzee is more like an earthworm than a human being, despite the close biological relations of chimpanzees to human beings. The small genetic difference between humanity and its closest relatives is actually a difference in capacity and potentiality that is indefinitely large, which actually means that it can never be fully measured. End of quote. Thus, at times, the existential value of being human becomes less a praise and recognition of the human stature, weighted in terms of artistic or scientific achievements, and more about the unmeasurable qualitative distinction represented by humankind itself, in contradistinction with the rest of the species on Earth. Even thinkers not necessarily committed to animal rights, but attentive to the implications that species arrogance can have on the status of women, like Anne Phillips, find Catev's argument troubling. Phillips writes that, I'm quoting Anne Phillips now, there is still something troubling about this repeated emphasis on our high value and superiority. My objection to Catev, continues Phillips, is not that he discriminates between human and non-human animals, it is that he makes so much of our superiority, end of quote. Unlike Catev, Waldron is a philosopher of law, less inclined to the existential pathos of species arrogance. This does not mean, however, that Waldron does not engage in species arrogance of its own in his discussion of dignity. Waldron's approach to dignity is heterodox, as he refuses the common view that sees law as a mere recipient of the moral content generated in and by moral philosophy. On the contrary, Waldron views law as retaining heuristic independence from moral philosophy, granting laws grammar and vocabulary conceptual independence or conceptual relevance of its own. In this context, Waldron asserts that law is dignity's natural habitat. That's Waldron's expression. And that the coherent conceptual image of what dignity means can be distilled from its construal in the realm of law alone. Waldron's reconstruction of the notion of dignity in law is based on rank. He acknowledges that dignity is entangled with hierarchical structures characteristic of traditional societies. The hierarchical structures Waldron has in mind consist of nobility and aristocratic ranks. Waldron sees, however, a potential paradox here. Upholding dignity for human rights discourse can be seen in tension with, I'm quoting Waldron, human rights ideology associated specifically with the denial that humans have inherent ranks, distinguishing some of them, end of quote by Waldron. And he continues, like a duke or a countess, right? But Waldron believes that the higher rank that dignity represents can be made compatible with an egalitarian conception of dignity if we think dignitarianism as based on the idea of aristocracy for all. In his words, I'm quoting Waldron now, Blastos argued that we organize ourselves not like a society without nobility or rank, but like an aristocratic society that has just one rank, and a pretty high rank at that, for all of us. Every man a Brahmin, every man a duke, every woman a queen, everyone entitled to the sort of deference and consideration in the way that nobles were entitled to deference. End of quote by Waldron. Waldron is here offering a counterintuitive account of how democratic societies are to be conceived after democratic revolutions. It is widely acknowledged that what makes the French Revolution such an iconic event in modern history is that it eliminates or abolishes aristocratic ranks in the name of freedom, equality, and fraternity, and not, as Waldron suggests, drawing on Blastos, that a democratic society universalizes a high quasi-aristocratic rank for all of us, the aristocracy of the common man, so to say. Describing democratic societies this way becomes obviously problematic to Don Herzog, one of the respondents to Waldron's Tanner lectures. Herzog worries about the potential toxicity in the idea that every man is a king in his castle. Herzog suggests that a special dignity for him implies, I'm quoting Herzog now, indignity and helplessness for others, end of quote. In particular, The idea of being a king in his castle can account for the fact that, I'm quoting Herzog again, the law found it so hard to frame marital rape as a crime, end of quote by Herzog. One can add species to Herzog's account of gender in his critique of Waldron. In my prior work, I pointed out that Waldron's take on dignity risked turning humans into stewards or Tudors at the expense of the underdog of other forms of life. I called Waldron's exclusive dignitarianism species aristocratism, underscoring the perils of putting in place new aristocratic hierarchies based on species at the very moment that aristocracy is claimed to be redistributed and universalized. Informed by a species-specific understanding of dignity, species aristocratism can be seen at work in several passages of Waldron's Tanner lectures. For example, Waldron suggests that, quote, applying a norm to a human individual is not like deciding what to do about a rabid animal, end of quote. And that ruling by law is, quote, quite different from, say, herding cows with a cattle prod, end of quote. The jarring passages by Waldron on non-human animals have also caught the attention of Will Kymlicka, who, together with Sue Donaldson, has been thinking about granting citizenship to domestic animals, rights to limited animals overlapping with human in urban spaces, and sovereignty to wild animals. In contrast to Cade van Waldron, Kymlicka argues that contemporary justifications of human rights based on the notion of dignity cultivate what he calls human supremacism, drawing parallels between speciesism and racial hierarchies, such as white supremacism, Kymlicka suggests that recent philosophical justifications of human rights offered by dignitarians rest on the assumption that human beings possess a status that distinguishes them from and places them above non-human animal species. According to Kymlicka, while human rights have offered necessary protection from dehumanizing treatment, contemporary justifications of human rights based on dignity risk turning protection into unfettered privilege and superiority. Criticizing the dignitarian position in the works by Cade, Waldron, and Catherine Dupré, Kymlicka writes, this is a quote by Kymlicka, this is a perfect encapsulation of the new dignitarian politics. If some humans are instrumentalizing other humans, the response is to say, you're making a category mistake. You should be instrumentalizing animals, not humans. If some humans are oppressing and exploiting other humans, the remedy is to throw animals under the bus, end of quote. In this context, Kymlicka challenges dignitarian accounts of human rights on the basis of the horizontality across species that emerges from our shared vulnerability. While I found Kymlicka's overall critique of human supremacism in dignitarianism compelling and also inspiring, it seems to me that his alternative argument on shared vulnerability across species invites further scrutiny. In particular, Kymlicka's case on shared vulnerability as a conceptual basis for human and non-human rights risks falling into what Bonnie Honig has called mortalist humanism. According to Honig, mortalist humanism is a peculiar type of recent humanism that abandons metaphysical notions of humanity based on reason and language to take refuge in the capacity to be subjected to violence as a new foundation for ethics. Accordingly, Honig has criticized authors like Giorgio Agamben and Judith Butler for placing too much emphasis on the ethical political traction of vulnerability. Drawing on Honig's insight, Dominique Orem introduced the idea of mortalist post-humanism to describe post-humanist theories grounded on vulnerability across species. From my perspective, Orem's notion is instructive when applied to Kymlicka's work on human supremacism. If critics of mortalist post-humanism are correct, The notion of a shared vulnerability across species risks becoming a new uncontested ground for a post-humanist ethics. The implications of this new foundation are that shared mortality is chosen over vitality, vulnerability over self-affirmation, and the protection of life itself over the agonistic pursuit of more ecologically conscious and demanding life worlds. If I understand Honig's and Orent's discussion of mortalism correctly, normative arguments focused on vulnerability can be caring, but also thanatic, by reducing that which is considered valuable to mere life alone. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to discuss inclusionary dignitarianism. So now I would like to move to one version of what I have called inclusive dignitarianism. The moral and political philosopher Pablo Gilabert provides robust philosophical justifications for the normative potential of dignity for human beings. In the process of his reflection, he recognizes the challenge of species-specific accounts of dignity and seeks to make the notion hospitable to non-human species. Gilabert offers a sophisticated analysis of the normative implications of dignity and of its relation to human rights. His approach to dignitarianism is expansive in terms of social and economic rights, since it is not circumscribed to negative duties of respect, but extends to positive duties of solidarity, to further other people's capacities to make choices and their access to opportunities to achieve well-being. That was a quote. Moreover, Gilabert undertakes a detoxification of dignity talk by challenging the exclusive dignitarianism of thinkers like Catev and Waldron. Uncomfortable with the notion of human dignity, Gilabert prefers the concept of dignity of human beings, as the former circumscribes dignity to human beings alone by conveying the, quote, exclusionary thought that the basis of dignity must only include features that human beings possess, but other entities do not. That was a quote by Gilabert. Moreover, in his later work, Gilabert returns to his critique of exclusionary understandings of dignity to defend an inclusive idea of dignity that is, in his words, compatible with recognizing that animals have dignity and rights, end of quote. I am mostly sympathetic to Gilabert's account of the expansive normative implications of dignity for human beings, but I am less persuaded by his argument that dignity talk is well equipped to do the inclusionary work beyond the human species that he is trying to achieve. So my objections to Gilabert's argument focus on two main points. The species-specific assumption at work in Gilabert's idea of humanity first, and the alleged entrenchment of dignity talk in moral and political discourse. On the first point, Gilabert argues that, I'm quoting him now, by making sense of human dignity, we can explain the content and force of human rights as the moral and political project that puts humanity first, end of quote. And adds, I'm quoting him again, human rights state the basic charter of the fellowship of humankind, end of quote. Gilabert's idea of putting humanity first in relation to the idea of a fellowship of humankind is supposed to challenge moral parochialism as justification for global inequality, as well as for racist, sexist, and xenophobic aggression. But putting humanity first can also be taken to mean that the moral consideration of other species should come second, if at all. In this context, Gilabert's characterization of human rights as the basis of the fellowship of humankind, together with the embrace of a humanist attitude, those are his words, humanist attitude, can be seen as not only stressing the species-specific content of dignity and rights, but also as dismissing post-humanist approaches as viable for moral and political philosophy. For example, the idea that domestic animals are also part of the family may never be intelligible if the fellowship of humankind, or the human family, as I have called it, drawing on the vernacular of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, gains unproblematic moral precedence. So my issue with Gilabert is that he's hospitable. I mean, he reworks the notion of dignity to make it hospitable to non-human animals, but his entire project is very humanist. So there's a tension between his gesture towards being more hospitable and his overall project in terms of human dignity. Put differently, Gilabert's insistence in humanity coming first risks trading one parochialism, nationalism, or tribalism for another, humanism, in the Anthropocene. In his latest paper, Gilabert writes, I'm quoting him, "When the leader of a powerful state says America or Canada first, we can plausibly reply that for some moral purposes, it is humanity that comes first. Some forms of global solidarity are called for and have higher priority." End of quote. Although I agree with Gilabert that the claim America first stands for a nationalist, anti-globalist gesture that evidences a parochial view of both politics and morality, Gilabert assumes that claiming humanity first stands for a clear and distinct defense of unbiased universality, perhaps in the genre of global justice. And yet, defending universality in this way can also be interpreted as a standard species parochialism that privileges the human species, humanity, over the plurality of non-human species that inhabit the earth. Thus, it seems that if dignity talk is going to be made inclusive, the treatment of notions such as humanity first and fellowship of humankind should be reworked in their alleged universality and problematized according to the political and moral imperatives required by the Anthropocene, as well as by Gilabert's own inclusivist position. On the second point, as stated above, Gilabert claims that we should continue to engage in dignity talk, as the latter is already entrenched in his words, political discourse, and especially in human rights discourse, end of quote, as well as in international documents enshrining human rights. Gilabert is right in pointing out that human rights discourse, international law, as well as various national constitutions engage in profuse dignity talk, but they do so, or so I argue, when grounding human rights, not necessarily animal rights. To be fair, dignity is mentioned once in the Article 10 of the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights, proclaimed at UNESCO in 1978, where exhibitions and spectacles involving animals are claimed to be incompatible with their animal dignity. But dignity talk is absent from recent constitutions that enshrine the rights of animals and nature. A quick look at the more inclusive constitutions in the Global South, such as Ecuador's Constitution of 2008, revised in 2011, Bolivia's Constitution of 2009, and the rejected draft of Chile's failed constitutional process, the first one, revealed that dignity talk is circumscribed to human rights, the dignity of labor, the dignity of the elderly, and the like. When these constitutional texts grant rights to animals and nature, they use the language of harmony, special protection, sentience, harm, conservation, and preservation, among others. Thus, the inclusive vernacular of Latin American constitutionalism remains a challenge to Gilabert's argument that engaging in dignity talk makes good practical sense. On the contrary, it may very well be that dignity talk is increasingly absent from national and international documents that seek to do the inclusionary work that Gilabert is after. So I'm going to part 3 now. In the pages above, I offered a discussion of the state of the art on the question of dignitarianism and its link with the dignity of non-human animals. I identified 2 main positions in the literature. On the one hand, theories like Cade and Waldron but also Habermas, conceive dignity as circumscribed to the human species. I dub this position exclusive dignitarianism, stressing the species-specific scope of this particular kind of dignitarianism. On the other hand, thinkers like Gilabert, but also Susie Kilmister, are open to rethinking the notion of dignity beyond the human species. I describe this position as inclusive dignitarianism. In the course of delineating these two positions, I drew on Kymlicka's critique of exclusive dignitarianism and pointed out a possible problem in his position, Kymlicka's, the question of post-humanist mortalism. For reasons of space, I can only sketch an alternative approach to extending dignity to non-human animals, or what I called animal dignitarianism. In my prior work, I presented objections to the possibility of extending a concept that carried with it a species-specific genealogy and normative impulse. I stand by those objections and would like to add some more based on the role that democratic revolutions play in the argument by dignitarians discussed above. As I anticipated at the beginning of this talk, dignitarians tell a story about democratic revolutions in terms of a leveling up of the plebeian human status to an upgraded aristocracy for all. This is especially evident in Waldron's brief discussion of Plasto's argument. However, does this story actually hold? Intellectual historian Samuel Moyn reminds us that dignity is absent from foundational documents in democratic revolutions, as it was associated with the aristocratic hierarchies that revolutions came to reject and abolish, not to universalize and redistribute. In fact, Moyn shows that dignity is reintroduced to the language of constitutionalism by Christians and becomes popularized in the 20th century by what he calls civil society Catholics, like Jacques Maritain, a key intellectual in the drafting of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If Moyn is right, the link that dignitarianism construes between aristocratic dignitas and the dignity of the common man is more complex than mere universalization and redistribution. Perhaps dignity was absent from foundational documents in democratic revolutions for a reason. Perhaps dignitas was, for democratic revolutionaries, a reminder of what they wanted to leave behind and not of what they wanted to turn into a universal elevated status. Thus, if dignity is not part of the egalitarian vocabulary of democratic revolutions, nor is it part of the vocabulary of new Latin American constitutionalism that seeks to advance the rights of non-human animals and nature, why should we care so much about animal dignitarianism? Rather surprisingly, the concepts of dignity and animal magnetism underwent a similar fate. They have both been discredited and taken to be conceptual nonsense. Although the rise of animal magnetism occurred in the years prior to the French Revolution, when mesmerism became influential among French radical Democrats, it has been recuperated by contemporary thinkers for whom ecocriticism intersects with feminist theory, animal studies, and political theology. Then and now, animal magnetism's relevance for political philosophy lies in its radical egalitarianism based on natural equality across species, in an enchanted worldview attentive to fluxes of sympathy, and in its emphasis on the interconnectedness of all forms of life. In this context, animal magnetism can offer alternative conceptual resources for thinking the status of non-human animals and ecocriticism from the perspective of radical democracy, or so I argue. If, as the intellectual historian Robert Darnton argues, animal magnetism was not only a radical political theory in pre-revolutionary France, but also, his words, a camouflage political theory very much like Rousseau's, end of quote, one may have to attend to animal magnetism's potential for rethinking species egalitarianism today. Interestingly, if we pay attention to the vocabularies of contemporary environmentalist constitutions like Ecuador's and compare it with the Society of Universal Harmony, an organization of supporters of animal magnetism that thrived at the end of the 18th century in Europe, mostly in France and England, we find that they both invoke harmony with nature as a non-dignitarian normative framework for species egalitarianism. Although Franz Anton Mesmer, the creator of mesmerism, also called animal magnetism, was himself mostly devoted with uneven success to proving the healing properties of his theory, radical mesmerists and revolutionaries like Nicolas Bergasse, Pierre Brissot, and Jean-Louis Carrat were part of the Society of Universal Harmony. The purpose of the society, according to Darnton, was to divulge animal magnetism in France and England in connection with egalitarian republican ideas about returning to a harmonious natural condition, loosely inspired by Rousseau. The animal studies scholar Carrie Weil focuses on animal magnetism's potential for rethinking eco-criticism today. She discusses the link between ideas of self-love, amour de soi, and compassion, pitié, for others in the natural condition introduced by Rousseau in the discourse on the origin of inequality, and the way flows of sympathy were conceptualized as conducive to the universal harmony sought by mesmerists. Weil emphasizes how, I'm quoting her, the acceptance of our shared animality was key for mesmerists as it was evidence of our shared nature and so of our shared equality, end of quote. Weil suggests that shared animality was used to mock and critique mesmerism with popular cartoons, I'm quoting her, that depicted Mesmer as an ass or magnetized patients as swooning dogs, end of quote. When viewed through the lens of animal magnetism, a radically democratic eco-criticism becomes an alternative to animal dignitarianism. In its quest for democratic notions of harmony in pre-revolutionary France, animal magnetism acknowledges what Bonnie Honig calls the agonistic nature of the political. They are actually making a revolution. In addition, animal magnetism's enchanted view of the world has the potential of provincializing the Western canon of political philosophy, opening a fruitful dialogue with Amerindian cosmologies and eco-critical political theologies in South America and beyond. In this sense, animal magnetism can be seen as opening a fragile portal of enchantment, sympathy, and self-doubt in the European canon of moral and political philosophy, which can be fruitfully assessed to explore unexpected connections with non-European worldviews and perspectives. To conclude, it is worth noting that a harmonious coexistence with nature is invoked 4 times in the Constitution of Ecuador, in passages like the following. We, women and men, the sovereign people of Ecuador, hereby decide to build a new form of public coexistence in diversity and in harmony with nature to achieve the good way of living, the summa causa. Thanks so much.